This is David Bell, wide receiver for the Cleveland Browns. You're listening to the Best Bell Fantasy Football Podcast.
And welcome into episode 34 of the Best Bell Fantasy Football Podcast. I am Bradley Stalder, and tonight I'll be doing a projections review of the Baltimore Ravens. In my previous podcast earlier this week, I did a live drafters fantasy draft, and on the Best Ball Streets, $20. So if you haven't used the promo code BestBell, make sure you do on the Best Bell promo. Okay, so awesome. Lots of fun on the Best Ball Streets. Nevertheless, let's get into it tonight. We'll begin with Lamar Jackson and setting the stage with the quarterback position for the Baltimore Ravens. Last season, they were one of the pass-heaviest teams, but that was in part due to the change of scheme that we saw employed after the injuries to Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins in the preseason. That required the Ravens to pivot to the likes of Tyson Williams, Devonta Freeman, and Latavius Murray, not the ideal running backs for the schemes that the Ravens wanted to run. So instead, they leaned a little bit more into the passing game. However, Josh Johnson and Tyler Huntley replaced Lamar for significant portions of the season due to Lamar's trips to the COVID list. As a result, Lamar Jackson did not play all 17 games, but he was on an historic pace for career highs in pass attempts. And I think that given the news of Lamar Jackson's progress and bulking up, and also the news that Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins may not be ready for the start of the season, we don't have clarity. And as a result, as part of these projections, all of projections is my opinion, using math about how things are going to go. So looking at Lamar Jackson's projections, I have him at 558 pass attempts. This is assuming 17 games. So obviously, if you're taking prize picks, bets, or any other lines, I think DraftKings dropped props earlier this year or earlier this week, you want to take the unders if these are really close, because these are median projections, and the likelihood that a player not only gets those median projections but does that over the course of 17 games is a lot lower than what you'd think. So I have Lamar Jackson passing 560 times if he plays all 17 games, and that is approximately the 51% pass rate. The Ravens last year, 66 plays per game, and I think that they can replicate that this year if they don't lean into the run and instead pass at a higher rate. 51%, they're not running the ball at 60% of the time anymore. They're going to be about 50-50 split. So that's my projection. 558 pass attempts, 64% completion percentage. That seems about typical for Lamar Jackson. 3,839 passing yards. And in talking with Kevin Scott, who does some high stakes leagues, he thought that yardage amount was about right for 17 games. 3,900, somewhere in that range. 22 passing touchdowns, 12 interceptions over the course of 17 games. Only about a 2.3, 2.2% interception rate. This is where I differ with Kevin on the projection for Lamar Jackson, and I have Jackson at 203 rush attempts over the course of 17 games, and that's giving Lamar Jackson a 37% rush share, which was his median rush share last season. Maybe this is a little high, but we saw Lamar Jackson have 40-50% of the rushes at some points last season. So to median that rush attempt at 37%, I think is reasonable. And then 6 yards per carry, about 5.5 yards per carry. I have Lamar Jackson over 1,100 rushing yards and approximately 7 rushing touchdowns on the season, putting him at 370 quarterback fantasy points. And looking at what that would have been last year, 370 would have been quarterback 4 in half-point PPR. So that would have been only behind Josh Allen, Justin Herbert, and Tom Brady. So I have a lot of optimism about Lamar Jackson given his rushing and increased pass rate. Now, there is a lot of uncertainty about this backfield. So I have Gus Edwards projected for 123 rush attempts and J.K. Dobbins projected for 146. Edwards at 22% rush share, J.K. Dobbins 26.5% rush share. They would combine for 8 touchdowns, 3 for Gus Edwards, 5 for J.K. Dobbins. But this is where the difference is. J.K. Dobbins, a 6% target share, 25 receptions, 170 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. Whereas Gus Edwards, I don't even have 10 targets for Edwards projected. So the difference between the two is pretty stark when it comes to projected running back points. So I have J.K. Dobbins projected for 145 half PPR points, and that would have been running back 28 last season, and Gus Edwards at 94 fantasy points. 94 would have been outside the top 50. Now, if Gus Edwards gets the start at the beginning of the season and J.K. Dobbins does not get off to a hot start, or if he's still recovering from the ACL injury but placed on the physically unable to perform list, that could be a reason why they are a lot closer. So consider that in your projections and in how you're thinking about these players. The only other meaningful part of this backfield, I guess there are two other like satellite ancillary pieces of this backfield. Mike Davis, I have projected for 33 rushes, 102 rushing yards, and a touchdown, 5% share, almost 30 targets, half of a receiving touchdown, 143 receiving yards. Tyler Beatty, though, that's a tough one to project because let's say Gus Edwards isn't ready and J.K. Dobbins isn't ready. Mike Davis can't last very long. He's 30 years old. He's a veteran running back who's seen better days. But Tyler Beatty's a better pass catcher. His player profile of comp is Gio Bernard. And I have Beatty projected conservatively at 5% share, almost 30 targets, 170 receiving yards, half of a receiving touchdown, 27 carries on the season, and a rushing touchdown. So I think that if it's not going to be Gus Edwards and it's not going to be J.K. Dobbins, it very well may be Tyler Beatty at the beginning of the season getting 7, 8%, 9% of the targets. We saw Devonta Freeman get involved in the passing game, and it could be Tyler Beatty who's the more dynamic player. Now, this is where I set all of Twitter ablaze. Rashod Bateman, I have conservatively at a 23% target rate. So 23% target share, I should say, 89 receptions, 132 targets, 1,000 receiving yards, and 3.5, 4 touchdowns. 165, 166 half PPR fantasy points. And last year, that would have put Rashod Bateman 166 at about wide receiver 28. That would have been behind Amari Cooper and Christian Kirk and Terry McLaurin last season, but ahead of Adam Thielen, Devonta Smith, Tyler Boyd. So that's where Rashod Bateman would be with just a 23% share. But if we were to bump that up to what I think, and this is what I set Twitter ablaze about, a 26% share, I think Rashod Bateman can get there. With a 26% share, that's 100 receptions, almost 150 targets, 1,100 receiving yards, 4 touchdowns. That puts him at 187 fantasy points, and that puts him at wide receiver 20 in half PPR. A top 20 wide receiver, and there's, I think, even more upside than that, than a top 20, probably 18, 16, mid wide receiver 2. Yes, like the Ravens are only going to pass about 50% of the time, but Rashod Bateman, we know he's a prime prospect, former first-round pick. Just got off to a slow start last season. Half of his games, 19.5% target share or more last season. He had a game where he was over 30% target share last season, and now Marquise Brown is gone. Who else is going to catch passes? It's going to be Bateman, and it's going to be Mark Andrews. Now, there's been some positive buzz about James Proche. So if we want to give him 8%, okay, or Devin Duvernay 9%, both of those players, not even 70 half PPR fantasy points, and you need to be 110 or higher to be like top 50 among all wide receivers. So maybe there's a spike week sprinkled in here and there, but James Proche and Devin Duvernay do not project to be wide receiver 4s even. And the last meaningful piece of this Ravens offense that I want to talk about projections wise, Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews, I have at a 24% target share, 94 receptions, 140 targets, 1,200 receiving yards, over 10 touchdowns I have projected. Last season, of course, Mark Andrews was the wide receiver one, the tight end one, I should say, with 247 fantasy points in half PPR. And this season, I do have him down a little bit to 233, but that still would be the tight end 2, only behind Mark Andrews last season. So I do have him projected to still hold a significant part of the offense and be used in the red zone, have his spike weeks for sure. But in my rankings, I still have Kelsey ranked higher just with the consistency there. Mark Andrews had a lot of single digit PPR, or even half PPR games. And I think Travis Kelce is the only sure thing in the Kansas City offense. So that's going to be who I lean into on the tight end position. But still, Mark Andrews, I have projected as a top 2. So let's not get carried away. I think he's going to be really good. All in all, I think the Ravens, you can stack. I was saying earlier this offseason that you shouldn't really be stacking Rashod Bateman, but Rashod Bateman's stock has increased, and I think you can stack Rashod Bateman with his upside, because instead of my projected 4 touchdowns, maybe he gets 6, and that puts him firmly in that high-end wide receiver 2 range. But Lamar Jackson's going to do it all this year. And if you want to draft Lamar Jackson naked, go for it. He's got almost 400. If Rashod Bateman gets a 26% target share, we're talking almost 400 fantasy points that could be within the range of outcomes for Lamar Jackson. And 402 was the quarterback one last season with Josh Allen. Lamar Jackson has that still within his range of outcomes. So you should be comfortable drafting Lamar Jackson. You should be comfortable drafting Rashod Bateman, Mark Andrews. There is around Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins in this backfield. But if I'm taking like a round 19, round 20 running back in, like, for instance, full PPR, the FFWC, or in drafters, you should be considering Tyler Beatty as one of those players to rotate through rookie running back. So yeah, those are my projections for those players, and ultimately I'm excited about seeing what Lamar Jackson still has in the tank. He had a tough year last year with all the COVID bouts and the Ravens not making it as far as they'd like. In fact, not making the playoffs at all, given how Cincinnati did. But so there really are only a few fantasy relevant options. And the Baltimore Ravens are poised for a big year from Lamar Jackson in a weaker division. If you think about it, the Browns got worse, and the Steelers, they're probably not much better with Trubisky than Ben Roethlisberger, like real life standpoint. Fantasy wise, I think it'll be better, but I don't think that the Steelers are in a position to rival the Bengals. So it's going to be the Ravens and the Bengals at the top of this division, I think, duking it out. And a lot of the fate of the Ravens rests on Lamar Jackson. He's got something to prove this year, not signed to a long-term deal yet. And you have to know that that's in the back of his mind is I want to perform. He wasn't even supposed to be a first-round pick. It was the last pick of the first round when he was drafted as a rookie. So he's been battling this narrative of, is he a running back? No, he's a quarterback, and he's shown that he can be an average passer in the league, which is exactly what you need for teams to respect your passing, and then also have an immense amount of rushing. That'll do it for today's podcast. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. If you haven't subscribed to the Best Bell Fantasy YouTube channel, make sure you do by clicking that red subscribe button. And of course, follow me on Twitter at FFStalder. You can also find the audio version of this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, wherever you listen to your podcasts, probably there. And of course, you want to check out the FFWC's Best Ball Championships and all of their other tournaments. They've got the Player Profiler Tournament. Use promo code BESTBELL when you deposit for the first time. That helps support the podcast, and FFWC, they're a good friend of the podcast. So check that out. Make sure that if you're depositing for the first time, use promo code BESTBELL. And they'll get you squared away there. They've revamped a lot of great things on the FFWC. Make sure you check out their website, FFWC and Full Time Fantasy. Thanks, everyone. Till next time, good luck in the best ball streets.